Hello and greetings from Michigan. My name is Pete Haak. I am the Michigan PRAMS Project Coordinator. Today we're going to take a look together at the relationship between maternal postpartum sleep, how much sleep are moms getting, and breastfeeding. The key question behind this questions, I guess, are just how much sleep are moms getting in the months after their baby's born, and also, do women who have stopped breastfeeding, i.e. those who are likely formula feeding, do they get more sleep than women who are still breastfeeding? You can see the contributors to this analysis at the bottom of the slide. Most of us are with the Michigan Department of Health and Human Services, except for my friend Galit, who joins us from the University of Michigan. I know that this talk has only just begun, but if you are already hungry for more population-based data about maternal sleep, then I would love to refer you to another presentation from the Michigan PRAMS team. It's called Partners Supporting Mothers in Postpartum Sleep. And if you search for that in the CityMatch app, I'm sure you will find it. And in this talk, my coworker Hannah Sauter will examine postpartum maternal sleep the same way that we will here. And she will look at how partner support may or may not influence that. And she will answer the exciting questions listed at the bottom. Laid out before you on this slide is the exciting path that we are going to journey on together. We will do a quick introduction and then we will be on to the methods for the study. And then we will spend some time looking at results and then thinking about the implications that these results may have. Although I am trained in perinatal epidemiology and analytic methods, I will readily admit that I am not a sleep guy. I'm not an expert on this, so I start by turning to those who are experts. Folks like those at the National Sleep Foundation who tell us that the recommended amount of sleep that an adult should get per night is 7 hours. There are a handful of studies in the literature about maternal postpartum sleep. But really, once baby is born, everyone's looking at how baby is sleeping. But some of those few articles cited here would include this one. The authors looked at sleep journals for 94 women who had depression during pregnancy, and they found that those who had fragmented sleep in the months after pregnancy really described their sleep as lacking. So we chose to examine this topic then for a couple of reasons. First is that there is not a lot out there on maternal sleep. And then second, I want to challenge some maybe commonly held perceptions or beliefs, things that would include statements like everybody knows that new parents are doomed to months and months of sleep deprivation. It's something that I hear. People say everyone knows that women who breastfeed get less sleep than women who formula feed. And everyone knows that a formula-fed baby sleeps longer than a breastfed baby. These are all examples of assumptions and possibly commonly held beliefs, and these sorts of things aren't really useful, nor are they actionable unless they are either confirmed or refuted with actual data. Which then leads us to these several research questions. The first and most important is typically something like, hey Pete, can your data set even address this research question? And I hope the answer is yes, otherwise this is going to be a very short presentation. Other research questions will include what proportions of Michigan mothers are getting the recommended amount of sleep per night. We will look at the demographic characteristics of women getting adequate and inadequate sleep. We will compare these demographic characteristics against the demographic characteristics for who is breastfeeding and who is not. And then really the big question for this talk is who is really more likely to report getting adequate sleep postpartum? Is it mothers who are likely formula feeding their infants, i.e. those who have stopped breastfeeding? Or is it mothers who are still breastfeeding at the time they complete the PRAMS survey? So this leads us to section 2 of the talk. We're going to look at the methods. We're going to talk a little bit about the PRAMS survey. I will show you some of the questions that we're going to look at from the survey, and then I will review the statistical tests that will be used. So the main source of data today is the Michigan PRAMS survey. That stands for the Pregnancy Risk Assessment Monitoring System. Each year we randomly select between 2,000 and 3,000 moms, depending on how we're running the survey that year. In the years that we're going to look at here, we selected randomly 10,544 moms. We then work really hard to get as many of them to answer as we can, and across these same years, we had 5,565 complete the survey. We choose to oversample mothers that have had a low birth weight infant. We want to know what's going on in their lives, good and bad. We oversample African American mothers because the state of Michigan is committed to doing everything we can to help improve outcomes for these moms and their babies. We owe it to them to do better. And then we oversample from Southeast Michigan just so that we get a clear picture of Southeast Michigan and also of the rest of Michigan. Most women complete the survey in the 3 to 9 month postpartum range. And thanks to the methodology we employ, we end up with a population-based survey that can tell us with some degree of certainty, statistical certainty, what's happening at the population level. Here we will tackle our first research question, namely, can the Michigan PRAMS survey help us to address the interface of maternal and postpartum sleep and infant feeding? And we do that by looking at infant age in weeks at the time that mom completes the PRAMS survey. And on the left-hand axis, you'll see this is just an unweighted count of the sheer number of responders and the postpartum point at which they're completing the survey. Everything you'll see from here on out is going to be weighted data. It will be representative of populations of moms. This is just looking at individual moms. And for those of us who are not fluent in weeks, that includes me, I will add a little bit of helper down to the bottom of the axis here, and we'll see that these are the infants who have not yet reached 3 months of age. They have completed 2 months, and 3, 4, 5, and I will pause here because this is the point at which the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that we start feeding infants their first non-liquid foods. Prior to this, we want to see infants on either breast milk or formula, a combination of the two, but we really don't want them on solid foods. And if we count up all the people to the left of this point, then we see that really 88% of Michigan PRAMS responders completed the survey during a time in which the AAP, healthcare in general, recommends that their infants eat only breast milk or formula. So encouraged by this, I continued onward with the analysis. So armed with thousands and thousands of responders, where prior research typically relies on something in the dozens or low hundreds, we look at the questions on the questionnaire that we'll focus on. The first is this one: in the last week, how much time on average did you spend sleeping each night? And moms they will pick from one of those 4 options. This is our main outcome of interest. It's virtually everyone answers it. There's 5.4% of responders who skip it. Main exposure of interest, did mom ever breastfeed or is she currently breastfeeding, is also something that very few people skip. So missingness is not a really big problem on these questions. The statistical tests used in this analysis are all listed here, and they're defining a unifying characteristic is that they all work with weighted survey data. So our population proportions come from this function within SAS-Collable Sudan. We use weighted walled chi-square tests to determine whether or not subgroup differences were significant. And then using propensity scores, I feed those into a weighted long binomial regression model that will examine the association between breastfeeding status and whether or not mom got adequate postpartum sleep. Shall we look at some results? Yeah, let's look at some results. So our next 2 research questions, what proportion of Michigan mothers are getting the recommended amount of sleep each night? And how does this vary across maternal demographic subgroups? The findings are, across the population of Michigan mothers from 2016 to 2018, we see that about 1 in 20 Michigan mothers are getting very little sleep each night at the time that they're filling out the survey. That's this 5.4%. The large majority of Michigan moms, 57.7%, were averaging 4 to 6 hours per night. In my life, I consider that the, quote, just barely enough, I can do this for a while, but not forever kind of amount of sleep. Turning the corner, just about a third of Michigan moms report that they got 7 or 8 hours of sleep on average each night. And this lucky 3% up here tell us that they are averaging 9 or more hours of sleep per night. And combining those last two gives us the number that we'll examine from here on out. 36.9% of Michigan moms report that they're getting 7 or more hours of sleep per night. These are our adequate amount of sleepers. Starting with that last number that's still fresh in our minds, 36.9% of Michigan moms reported getting adequate sleep. We'll look at some subgroup differences by maternal age, by education, by marital status. This next one makes sense. Moms who have just had their first baby are a little bit more likely to be getting adequate sleep compared to mothers who have had several babies. There could be other kids around the house competing for attention during the night. And there are differences by race ethnicity subgroups, and there's a definite gradient by income. As household income increases, so does the probability that mom is reporting adequate postpartum sleep. However, income is often quite missing. 12% of moms on PRAMS choose not to share their income. So I use this broader binary variable in modeling, which is whether or not mom was likely eligible for federal services. And we see a notable difference across these groups. Our main outcome of interest is adequate maternal sleep. Our main exposure of interest is going to be breastfeeding. We're going to look at how many moms are still breastfeeding at the time that they complete the PRAMS survey. From that, we infer what proportion of moms are likely to be exclusively formula feeding at the time they complete the PRAMS survey, and are there differences across maternal demographic groups. And given the postpartum time of survey response, it's probable that most women not breastfeeding are in fact formula feeding. Michigan PRAMS data tells us across these years that just about 1 in 7 moms, that's the 13.8%, never initiated breastfeeding. Just over a third, 35.8%, initiated and breastfed for a while, but they had stopped by the time they answered the survey. And then finally, the last piece of the donut, just over half of Michigan moms tell us that they are still breastfeeding their infants at the time they completed the survey. And from here on out, we're going to make comparisons between that 50.3% that are still breastfeeding against those that breastfed some, and then also against those who never breastfed. Although there are 3 different groups of interest when it comes to breastfeeding status, I'm only going to show you demographics for one of those groups of moms in the interest of time. This is the demographics for moms still breastfeeding the day that they completed PRAMS. We see, I think the scientific term is ginormous, differences across age, education, and marital status subgroups in terms of who is still breastfeeding. There are less pronounced differences by parity, and then large differences once again across race ethnicity groups, income, and my binary service eligible variable. And statistically, there is significant variation across each of these demographic groups, and that holds true for the other subgroups of breastfeeding. On to our final research question. Compared to our 2 different groups of moms who are no longer breastfeeding, are Michigan mothers who are currently breastfeeding more or less likely to report getting an adequate amount of sleep? In other words, does common knowledge win? Are these moms going to pay a penalty for their breastfeeding choices when it comes to their own sleep? And if we start with mothers who never initiated, 32.5% are getting adequate sleep. Mothers who did some breastfeeding, 35.8%, are getting adequate sleep. And then our moms who are breastfeeding at the time they complete the survey, 38.8% are getting adequate sleep. So at first pass, we're a little bit more likely to see that currently breastfeeding mothers report they're getting an adequate amount of sleep at night. If we look at the size of the differences by maternal breastfeeding status as ratios, and these are prevalence ratios, but they're used just and interpreted the same way as a risk ratio, then we see there's a higher risk of adequate sleep, which is a good thing, 1.19, for still breastfeeding mothers compared to those who had never initiated. And we also see a higher risk of adequate sleep, comparing those still breastfeeding mothers against those who initiated but stopped breastfeeding before they completed the survey. If we were writing something up for the sake of a clickbait internet article, we would now state that this one simple trick helps new mothers to get more sleep. That simple trick being breastfeeding. But we're not clickbait article writers, we're scientists, and scientists who ourselves lose sleep each night worrying about bias and confounding and reaching the wrong conclusions. Therefore, before we make any conclusions, we know that we need to consider demographic and other life factors and how that might play into what we've just seen. These might be influencing the relationship between breastfeeding and maternal sleep, and we really owe it to everyone to try to adjust for these factors using statistical modeling. I share with you now the final numbers that we're going to look at together, and this answers our overall big question. Are Michigan mothers who are currently breastfeeding as likely to get adequate sleep as women who are likely exclusively formula feeding? And where we saw a 1.19 risk ratio before, we see that it's diminished to a 1.03 for moms breastfeeding versus those who never did. Where we saw a 1.08 risk ratio, it's now diminished to a 0.99. And usually when I had a statistically significant difference between groups that goes away after controlling for confounding, I appear outwardly happy because I've just done my job as an epidemiologist and I've adequately tested my hypothesis. But inside, I'm sad that the relationship that I saw between two things that I thought was important was not actually important. In this case, on this slide though, I'm still pretty thrilled with these risk ratios. The reason is we never set out to assert that more women who breastfeed get adequate sleep compared to women who were not breastfeeding. Instead, we came at this thinking that fewer moms currently breastfeeding, when they answer PRAMS, would be getting adequate sleep compared to women who, in the public reasoning, get to give their baby a big formula feeding right before bedtime, and thus mom gets more sleep. So although we lost what was a significantly greater risk of a good thing, that moms who are breastfeeding are getting more sleep by the time we make these adjustments, we're still left with the good news of being able to say that it's probable that women who are still breastfeeding get no more sleep and no less sleep than women who are likely exclusively formula feeding. So consider these results a first draft. We now know that there's enough here to examine with this relationship between maternal sleep and breastfeeding to press onwards and look for a place to share this possible good news. But further analysis will need to examine a few other potential confounding or effect modifying or mediating factors. And things that we've already looked at and controlled for are in these little black boxes: maternal race, previous live births, federal service eligibility. All of these different things that we can look at and we can control for in PRAMS really need to be evaluated. Ooh, this one in the dash line, this is my last shout out to Hannah Sauter. Go check out her talk to look at the relationship between partner support and inadequate sleep. So we consider these to be the next steps in this analysis. And we will now conclude our time together. So just to recap, about 6 in 10 Michigan moms did not get what we would consider to be adequate sleep, and just under 4 in 10 did get an adequate amount of sleep. We saw that half of women are still breastfeeding at the time they complete the PRAMS survey, and we know from hopefully the AAP recommendations the half who have stopped breastfeeding are likely exclusively formula feeding their infants. And we saw that after adjusting for potential contributing factors, Michigan moms who were still breastfeeding were no more likely, but also no less likely to get an adequate amount of sleep compared to women who had stopped breastfeeding. Very few postpartum women in Michigan would complain of getting too much sleep, of being overly rested, but it's also likely that breastfeeding alone, we can say, was probably not a significant barrier to adequate sleep in the postpartum period. And if we refine this analysis and publicize these findings, I would love to get the word out to pregnant women who are trying to decide whether or not to breastfeed. The reality is that many women are not getting a ton of sleep during the window examined by PRAMS, but if a woman is wondering to herself, will I get more sleep if I stop breastfeeding or if I never start breastfeeding and just feed my baby formula? The answer is probably no. I acknowledge that there are definite challenges and limitations to this study, including we're inferring formula feeding based on infant age at the survey completion. I saw that infant age at survey completion is not independent from demographic characteristics, breastfeeding, or maternal sleep. However, as you remember, that count from that first graph is all unweighted data. And to take unweighted data and try to use it to control for things at a population level is exceedingly difficult. It's entirely possible that some of the currently breastfeeding mothers may be supplementing breast milk with formula. There are many additional unexamined confounders, and we did not include the concept of sleep fragmentation, which we believe to be important. Strengths, though, of the study, we have much larger numbers than the few other studies out there on this topic. The data is population representative. We have a low rate of missingness for the questions, and we controlled for potential confounding using multivariate modeling. And we still have several exciting possible mediators to investigate, including partner support. Some general strengths and limitations for the PRAMS survey are listed here. Please feel free to pause, read, meditate on these. So many folks read and contributed to this analysis in thoughtful ways. Many people helped to collect the data that was shared. But most importantly, I would not have results to share with you if it were not for the thousands of moms who choose to, using a pen and paper or through the medium of a phone call, let us know about the things in their lives that were going well and the things that caused them to struggle in the times before, during, after pregnancy. So we especially thank them for sharing with us. Our references can be seen here. And with that, I conclude. I thank you so much for watching this talk. Because we are not sharing a physical space, the discussion element of this is going to be a little bit different. But I mean this 1000%. I would love it if you got in touch with either supportive comments or give me some challenging feedback. And you can see my email address there, haakp@michigan.gov. If you're interested in checking out other PRAMS data products, go on over to michigan.gov/PRAMS. Thank you so very much.